All right, well, I want to welcome all of you to the fifth part of our 8-part series on religious liberty. We know it might sound like a lot, but I think with the amount that has already been presented, I think you can see why it's something that it's not an important topic until it is an important topic. And for some of us who've experienced countries and situations where there's a lack of religious liberty, we're getting a very good, well-rounded education from all the different presentations that have been made. And tonight, we're really excited. And you should be excited too, because this is someone from outside of our committee that actually has expertise in this area. So now we finally have an expert here, and we're so glad that Jennifer Hawks is joining us. Why don't we just bow our heads for prayer, and then I'll introduce her and let her take over. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your gift of life. Lord, we thank you for the gift of freedom that the Bible tells us wherever your Spirit is, there is freedom. So, Lord, we pray tonight that your Holy Spirit will be here. May it be with Jennifer as she presents, and may we walk away from this with a better understanding of you and your kingdom and how we can apply it here. We thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So Jennifer Hawks is originally from Germantown, Tennessee, and she is the Associate General Counsel at the BJC, and you can see that on the screen. That's a Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty. She provides legal analysis on church-state issues that arise before Congress, the courts, and administrative agencies. She also assists in education efforts and responds to pastors and other constituents who have questions about church-state matters, aka us tonight. So we appreciate that. Before coming to the BJC, Hawks, she was the Director of Advocacy and Outreach Services for the Family Abuse Center in Waco, Texas, where she conducted a legal clinic and led educational programs. She previously worked for 2 judges in the state of Mississippi and served as a staff attorney for the Mississippi Department of Human Services. She also served in both paid and volunteer ministry positions in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Texas, and she has published papers in the Journal of the Texas Baptist Historical Society and Baptist History and Heritage Journal. She's a graduate of Mississippi College and University of Mississippi School of Law. She earned also a Master of Divinity degree from George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University. And she is a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, Texas, and Mississippi bars, and she was ordained into the gospel ministry by the McLean Baptist Church in McLean, Virginia. So let's welcome Jennifer Hawks to our presentation tonight.
Thank you all very much for the warm welcome. I have always been welcomed by Seventh-day Adventists, and so I'm glad to see that continuing. I just want to start off with, I enjoy working with your national and global offices up in D.C. and Maryland, so it's always good to meet with the local congregation here. So I was asked to speak about Christian nationalism, which we're going to get to, but since y'all are in a religious freedom series, I feel it's important that y'all learn my perspective of religious freedom and where we're coming from. So I'm going to do the briefest and quickest of religious freedom presentations so you can get the BJC, you can get a flavor for our perspective. We'll have time for questions at the end. I'm happy to answer questions about that part of the presentation in addition to Christian nationalism. And I'm also fine if y'all want to interrupt with questions, but we will have the time at the end. But I want to make sure that we have a good dialogue and discussion time together. So I do work at Baptist Joint Committee, so we are in D.C. Our offices are on Capitol Hill across from the Senate office buildings and the Supreme Court, so I have a great view out of my office window, best view I've ever had as a professional, so very glad to be there, and we always get friends that come visit us, so it's a great location. A lot of people, they want to know who we are, so we are supported by these Baptist denominations that you see on the screen. The Religious Liberty Council is everyone who has ever donated to us. So we have many non-Baptists who make up our Religious Liberty Council, and they have board representation, so they help guide our organization as well. BJC sees support for religious liberty from 3 places: biblical basis, Baptist history, and our constitutional protections. So y'all are in the midst of an 8-week series. I don't have to go into detail with these things. So the briefest explanation of the biblical basis that I can give is that the Bible is God's invitation to relationship. And if God hasn't demanded us to be followers and to be robots, then no government should have that authority or that ability either. Baptist experience, Baptist history. Baptists were persecuted in the U.S. We were the wrong kind of Christian. So we had pastors who were jailed, who were whipped. We had regular congregants who were similarly fined or jailed because they were taking communion or the Lord's Supper outside of the presence of the established church. And so I always like to bring up some quotes from some of our Baptist leaders. And I tend to choose quotes where our Baptist leaders were talking about non-Baptists being protected. Especially in this day and age, we hear a lot of people saying, sorry about that. We hear a lot of people saying that our early founders, they only meant Christians. No one ever contemplated non-Christians. And that's just not true. If you've read from any of our founders, there is discussion of non-Christians among us. Thomas Helwys was one of our founding Baptists. He was an English Baptist. He would be imprisoned for in part for what is on the screen, and he would die in prison because of that. But he basically said, it's not up to the king. It's an individual decision. We have to stand before God and not the king in matters of conscience. But he says, let them be heretics, Turks, which was the word for Muslim in that day and age, Jews, or whatsoever. It appertains not to the earthly power to punish them. And then Roger Williams, of course, our founder of the First Baptist Church in America. He was Baptist for about 6 months, but we do get to claim him. He was a perpetual seeker, but he also spoke of very strongly about religious freedom. And this is one of his quotes. He talked about pagans, Jews, Turks, and anti-Christian consciences. He was very much aware of other perspectives, in part because he was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony for being the wrong kind of Christian. John Leland is one of our Virginia Baptist leaders during the Revolutionary era, and this is one of our favorite quotes of his. Let every person speak freely without fear, maintain the principles that he believes, worship according to his own faith, either one God, 3 gods, no God, or 20 gods, and let the government protect him in so doing. So clearly, one of our leading Baptist pastors of the time was contemplating including those who believe differently from what he was teaching and preaching. Constitutional protections, Article 6, no religious test. If you're setting out to found a Christian country, you're going to have a religious test. I mean, it doesn't really require much explanation after that. But the colonies had religious tests. It was what they were familiar with. But when our founding fathers set out to write the Constitution, they specifically declined to impose a religious test. And there are people who say, well, again, they were just talking about Christians. No one thought that a non-Christian would be running for office. Again, not true. If you look at the letters from people who were at the Constitutional Convention, there's one, I think it was from New Hampshire, but he was talking about how we have to get rid of this because a Unitarian might become president one day. That was the group he was afraid of. And so this was a controversial article that was debated, and it was definitely a break from tradition. But if you were setting out to found a Christian country, at least your leadership would have to affirm some connection to Christianity, to either specific doctrines or membership, if not even required for full citizenship as well. And then, of course, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Establishment and free exercise are 2 religion clauses, and we deal with court cases that try to interpret those small 16 words. That is the reason I have a full-time job. So that's all that I do is those 16 words. BJC works in Congress, the courts, learn with us as education, and then make a difference. We are trying to empower our supporters and people who follow us so that they can be agents of change in their own communities. So they can take the good information that we put out and figure out a way to apply it to their own context. This is all of our contact information, so we would love to have you follow us on social media. Amanda Tyler is our executive director and is doing a phenomenal job. She's been on lots of media talking about Christian nationalism. So if you're aware of BJC and Christian nationalism, you have seen Amanda Tyler at some point. Christian nationalism. It is a political ideology that seeks to merge our American and our Christian identities, and it distorts both our faith and our constitutional democracy. It's always important to start with definitions. So this is where we're starting from. We know that Christian nationalism is false. As Christians, Seventh-day Adventists, y'all are a global church. So you know this just as well, if not better, than we Baptists. The gospel isn't bound by any national border. And so you don't have to be an American to be Christian. And we also know, as students of history, that non-Christians have been with us from the beginning. They have helped build our country. And so you don't have to be a Christian to be a good American. So if you just stop and think for a moment, the ideology all blows away. The problem is, we often get caught up in rhetoric, and we get caught up in friends like us. And Christian nationalism is sneaky because it uses the language of Christianity, but instead of pointing us to Christ, it points us to something else. It points us to a person, it points us to a party, it points us to a political ideology. And we don't always recognize it in the moment when it's happening. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Some examples of Christian nationalism, how we see it. And I hope we have some good conversation along the way. It's often described as white Christian nationalism because the purpose of Christian nationalism is often to cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. One of the best examples of this is, if y'all will remember earlier this year, we had the shooting in the Buffalo grocery store. So the gentleman who committed the heinous act, if you read his manifesto, he says, "I am not a Christian. I do not ask God for forgiveness, but I'm doing this to support Christian values." So we as Christians have to wrestle with, what does that mean? He felt he could uphold Christian values by attacking a grocery store in a minority neighborhood, that was perpetuating Christian values. And the reason he can say that is because of ideology like Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is not Christianity. It uses the language and symbols of Christianity, but directs us to a gospel of power instead of a gospel of love. So we always need to be conscious and aware. Someone who is using our rhetoric, someone who's using our language, someone who's using our music, what is the purpose of this? And are we being led to Christ, the church, our religious life, or are we being led to something else? If we're being led to something else, then we need to be suspicious, and there's potentially a problem. Christian is more about identity. Again, with the Buffalo shooter, he felt that the phrase Christian values was synonymous with whiteness and with power. And so that's what he was perpetuating while he actively rejected the religious background or tradition that would should have informed, at least, Christian values. The other question we get a lot is about patriotism. Christian nationalism is not patriotism. There are lots of ways to be patriotic. My dad was a member of the U.S. Marine Corps during Vietnam. We have an American flag outside of my parents' house. I guarantee you it's flying right now. He's got the Marine Corps flag under it. That's one way to be patriotic. Running for office is a way to be patriotic. Showing up at school board meetings is a way to be patriotic. Serving as a public school teacher is a way to be patriotic. There's all kinds of ways that we can be patriotic and show our love for our country. And we should, as people of faith, be engaged in the civic life of our country. Nationalism is different. Nationalism goes to a different level, and it demands allegiance above all else. And so this allegiance to this party, to this person, to this ideology has to come above all else. And so that's where we see a real split. So nationalism is not the same as patriotism. We can all still be very patriotic and not be Christian nationalists. Christian nationalism needs a myth, and it has to rely on a version of our history that will support the idea that our country was founded by and for Christians, and typically it goes further, by and for white Christians. So it discounts much of our history. It discounts the fact that the land was already inhabited when European settlers came. Our Native American traditions contributed a lot to our country, but that undermines the Christian nation myth. And so we have to forget them. We have to overlook them. It has to discount the role of slavery in our history, because that doesn't feed into the idea of Christian nation. And it picks up on the things that benefit white Christians. So the Christian nation myth is going to rely on the fact that the U.S. was founded only for religious freedom. And I work in religious freedom. Sounds like a good statement to make, right? Problem is, it's not true. The U.S. was founded for many reasons. The colony of Virginia, which went on to become one of our leaders in religious freedom, was founded for economic purpose and to serve the crown and to make more money for the United Kingdom. That's why it was founded. The Puritans came for religious freedom, but they were coming to Virginia. They got sidetracked in Massachusetts. And so there were multiple reasons why people came to the U.S. It wasn't just for religious freedom. And we have to be able to tell the full story of our history. And again, when I did the brief intro of Article 6, if you're founding a Christian nation, you're going to require some form of a religious test. And so the fact that we have Article 6 proves that our founders did not set up a Christian nation when they set about founding our great country. There have been some polls recently, including this poll, which was in May of this year, so it's very recent. And we're going to look at political affiliation and religious affiliations. So one of the questions that was asked, does the U.S. Constitution allow the U.S. government to declare the U.S. to be a Christian country? And Republicans, Independents, Democrats, majority of everyone said no. It does not permit that to occur. And that is good news. The next question was, should the U.S. declare itself to be a Christian nation? And we got some different answers on that one. Having answered that the Constitution does not allow this, we had an increase in people who said, but we want it to happen anyways. So then when we look at religious groups, same questions. It was the same pool of people, but these were different markers to look at. We Baptists have some work to do, because Baptists were the highest group that said the Constitution would allow it. The Constitution does not allow it. But they looked at Baptists, Catholics, other Christians, and then non-Christians. But we saw the same trend when the question changed from is this permissible to should we do it? And should we do it? Baptists and other Christians, a majority of them said that we should declare it to be a Christian nation, even though we have just answered the question saying we know it's not allowed. So what are some examples of Christian nationalism? One of the hard things in talking about Christian nationalism is the way it comes up, and we don't often talk about it as examples of Christian nationalism. But one is the state bills that require the posting of "In God We Trust." Not all Americans have a belief in God. So to require public school kids to sit in classrooms where there's a prominent posting of "In God We Trust" is a form of Christian nationalism. Another one is some of our monuments. This was a court case from a couple of years ago. It's a cross on public land. It's a traffic circle in the middle of this very busy intersection, not too far from D.C. And the question is, what is the role of government in maintaining or having these kinds of monuments? And again, this is using a symbol of Christianity. BJC's brief was the cross is important to Christians because that had been overlooked and neglected because it didn't help the narrative. But it's the government taking a religious symbol but pointing back to a government purpose instead of the purpose of the church. And the most violent form was the insurrection in January 6th. BJC helped create a report. It's the most comprehensive coverage of how Christian nationalism played a role on January 6th. And we saw Christian crosses, we saw banners, we heard Christian music. There was a prayer in the Senate chamber. As people were rifling through the senator's desk, they paused for prayer so that God would bless their actions. But there's also a very subtle form that's present in a lot of our churches. And do we have an American flag in our sanctuary? And I'm not saying every church that has an American flag in their sanctuary is perpetuating Christian nationalism. But we need to stop and think. What is the purpose of having an American flag in the place where we are worshiping God? In this example, the flags are equal in size and location. Are we saying the two kingdoms are equal? Because that's what the visual is saying. And so we as Christians need to stop and think, when we use the language of the state and when we pull in the state's rhetoric and into our worship spaces, what are we communicating when we do that? There are 4 responses to Christian nationalism that sociologists have identified. We do a lot of work with Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, who have the leading scholars really on Christian nationalism and how it plays out in the U.S. So the 4 categories are up there. Rejectors is obvious. These are the people who actively reject Christian nationalism. They're on the lookout for it, and they are trying to reduce its effect within our society. Resistors are people who are inclined to say no, but they're not as active in rejecting it as rejectors. So accommodators is those who are maybe inclined towards Christian nationalism, or at least the rhetoric of it. They're not stopping to examine the language or the rhetoric, but they're not actively promoting it. So they're not, sharing all this social media memes and not actively using the language of Christian nationalism. Ambassadors are those similar to the rejectors, but on the opposite side, those who have fully embraced the idea of Christian nationalism and are actively pushing it out. And so luckily, that's the smallest percentage of our society. The problem is they're a very loud minority within our society. So we hear a lot from them. And it's up to us who are accommodators, resistors, and rejectors to speak out as well. So BJC created a campaign called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We started this campaign in July of 2019. And we started it then because we looked around and we had the shooting at Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina. We had the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pennsylvania. There was a shooting at another Jewish house of worship in California. And there seemed to be this rise of a particularly violent form of what we now call Christian nationalism. It was not a word that was used a whole lot in 2019, if you can think back a couple of years. But it had been used some, and we gathered a group in D.C. at our offices. We do a lot of interfaith work, a lot of coalition building, so we had a lot of different religious traditions around the table. And we said, we've seen these shootings. We're seeing these problems. There had been the shooting in New Zealand where the shooters referenced back things happening in America as what inspired them to their action. And we thought there was something we as people of faith needed to do to stand up. Because when it's unsafe to go to your house of worship, religious freedom is under attack. And it broke my heart because around the table, everyone who was a non-Christian said this is not safe for us to speak about. This is something you Christians need to take on because it's not safe for us to do so. These were friends of mine, our friends of mine. We've worked on many issues together. Never once have I had anyone from those groups say it's not safe for me to speak out on this topic. This is the topic that it's not safe for them, which puts more of the duty on us as Christians to stand up and to speak out. So we reconvened all the Christian groups and said, what can we do? We need to stand with our friends who feel physically unsafe to be able to talk about this topic. And so we created the campaign, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, because sometimes you just have to be clear. There's a time and place for cute, fancy names, and then sometimes you have to be clear and direct. So this is Christians Against Christian Nationalism. But it's also important to talk about what you're for. The QR code will take you to sign the statement, so I would encourage everyone in the room and those watching online to check out the statement and to sign it. We focus on these beliefs because just as it's important to say what you're against, it's also important to say what you're for, right? So if you sign the statement, you are saying that you agree with these handful of statements. People of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. Patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. One's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. Government should not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. Religious instruction is best left to our houses of worship, other religious institutions, and our families. America's historic commitment to religious pluralism enables faith communities to live in civic harmony with one another without sacrificing our theological convictions. Conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous and often leads to the oppression of minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of religion. And then finally, we must stand up to and speak out against Christian nationalism, especially when it inspires acts of violence and intimidation, including vandalism, bomb threats, arson, hate crimes, and attacks at houses of worship against religious communities at home and abroad. So these are the things that we're for as we're against Christian nationalism. We see Christian nationalism come up in policy. We see it in state-level debates, local debates, and at the federal level. Those who embrace Christian nationalism, those who are the ambassadors and who are pushing it out, are often scared of immigrants, refugees. They report being uncomfortable with interracial marriages and biracial children, and adoptions as well. We see it come up in schools, opposition to scientists and science education, and they're more likely to approve of authoritarian tactics in the political space. BJC has a couple of podcasts that we've talked about this topic. So when we launched the campaign, again, since Christian nationalism was a new topic that hadn't been talked about a whole lot, my boss, Amanda Tyler, did a 10-week series on what is Christian nationalism. So she talked to academics, she talked to theologians, she talked to historians, she talked to activists, and recorded the conversation. BJC has also created a curriculum guide to go along with it, so that we could have small group discussions either in our churches or in our communities, and we can all learn about Christian nationalism together. And our more current series is Respecting Religion, and that's Amanda Tyler and our General Counsel, Holly Holman, sit down every week and have an amazing conversation about some topic of religion or religious freedom that they're seeing in our community. Many of those episodes have talked about Christian nationalism. the one next week will be about Christian nationalism. So I encourage you to check out the podcast and hear what they're saying about it. We also have a lot of resources on our website. This is not a campaign that's going to cure any problem overnight. It is a campaign for hearts and minds. Christian nationalism has been baked into our society. It has ebbed and flowed, but we are seeing a particularly violent form of it these days, which requires us to stand up and take a response. So we wanted to create resources to help people, to empower them to have those conversations with their friends and their neighbors. People don't change their mind because of some talking head on TV. They change their mind because someone who they care about has introduced a new concept to them. Someone they care about cares enough about them to have a conversation with them. So our resources are designed to help us have these conversations. So we have discussion guides for webinars that we've hosted for the podcast series. Again, we did our report on January 6th, which collects all the information in one place. The report was written by various scholars, and they brought their full self, they brought their expertise to the evidence and gave some explanation around it. We have a one-pager that defines Christian nationalism that we think is handy and helpful. And then we have lots of recommended readings. We have books, articles, for those who really want to go deeper and learn more. What else can we do? So we want you to use our resources. That's why we created them. If there's a resource that you think would be helpful, contact us and let us know. That's what gives us a lot of our ideas for what needs to come next. Who do we need to partner with? Who do we need to talk to? But when someone says the U.S. is a Christian nation, ask them what they mean by that. If they're talking demographics, then maybe we can let the statement slide. But most people aren't talking demographics when they make that statement. So have that conversation. Be willing to ask the question. Fostering relationships across division. So intentionally seeking out friends who don't look like you, who don't live in your neighborhood, who are somehow different from you. And having those relationships, hearing their perspective, learning from them, can go a long way in helping us correct this curve. Talk about the dangers of conflating religion and patriotism. The danger of Christian nationalism is it's trying to redirect our religious devotion, again, away from our religious principles to something else. And that is dangerous. One of the things behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine is Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is not unique to America. Religious nationalism is not unique to Christianity. It is something, a nationalist form of a majority religion can occur in any religious tradition in any country. But we have seen the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church has blessed the actions of the Russian government because it is recapturing their Ukraine territory that the church believes is theirs. Ask the purpose behind using Christian language or symbols in a government setting. So I wrote an article for the Canopy Forum about the ways that Christian nationalism is a danger to religious freedom. And one of my examples that I wanted people to ponder is if we think back to President Biden's inauguration, Garth Brooks did an amazing rendition of Amazing Grace. I love Amazing Grace. I like Garth Brooks. It was a great performance. But Amazing Grace is a uniquely Christian song. It's a song about God's redemption. And so what was the purpose of using this very Christian song in a very government setting? This was our transition of government power from one administration to the next. What was the purpose in that? I gave many other examples as well. So one of the most obvious that a lot of people have talked about was when Jeff Sessions cited Romans 13 to quell the controversy when people were objecting to the separation of families happening at the border. And he made the statement as if to say, Romans 13 says that we're supposed to support the government, so why are you questioning me? That is nationalism. If we're not allowed to ask questions of our democratic elected government officials, We are entering into the world of nationalism and out of our democracy, constitutional republic. We need to denounce acts of violence that are committed in the name of Christian values. There are a lot of Christians who go astray, and as the majority religion, we have the advantage of everyone gives us the benefit of the doubt. Well, that was the bad seed. We're not going to condemn the whole church because this one person did this thing. Our minority friends don't have that advantage. When someone in their community does something heinous, there's immediately attention drawn to that house of worship, to that community. So we need to be willing to stand up just as we expect them to when there is violence done in our name. And we need to be a circuit breaker. So we're going to hear conversations around us. We need to be willing to take a stand so that actions don't become violent, so that we never get to that violent extreme. None of us want to see January 6th happen again. But if we're not willing to address Christian nationalism, then it's going to happen again. So that's my prepared remarks. I wanted to make sure we had time for questions and discussion. So if anyone has a comment or a question, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry I was a few minutes late, so I missed the very first part. But you make an interesting point about expressions of faith in governmental settings. And I'm interested in your assessment of the difference between sort of an endorsement type of act. So take the Garth Brooks example. Suppose that was Joe Biden just telling the nation, I'm a man of faith, and faith will be part of how I govern. I think about Franklin Roosevelt's prayer on the eve of the D-Day invasion. People in public office are sometimes people of faith, and it's natural for any of us who have faith to express our faith. How do we tell the difference between a legitimate expression of faith by the office holder versus an exploitation of faith for some political end?
I mean, that's a great question, and there's not an easy answer. I can't give you 3 factors to look at, and that's always going to make the difference. But we need to be willing to ask questions and think about what is the purpose of using this. Joe Biden is a man of faith. He's a man of deep Catholic faith. He attends Mass on a regular basis. And so I know from a personal reason why he might want a song like Amazing Grace at his inauguration. But the purpose of inauguration is to transfer power. That is the purpose of that ceremony. President Biden has given many speeches and alluded to his Catholic faith. And I want our elected officials to talk about their faith. Want them to be as open about their faith as they want to be. But we have to look at the context, the setting, the purpose. And we as Christians know what the church is. We as Christians know what our language is supposed to point us to. And so if a politician is consistently using Christian language, but it's not backed up by faithful commitment, if it's not backed up by Christian, pursuing the best of us, we should be suspicious. BJC doesn't call anyone a Christian nationalist. We think it's an ideology that has infected all of us to varying degrees. So some people have fully embraced it, and some people are rejecting it, but we've all been influenced by it. So we can't say, these are the bad people, these are the Christian nationalists that you need to look out for, and the rest of us are fine, because that lets all of us off the hook, right? But we all have a duty to stand up and to speak out, and just to ask questions, be willing to reevaluate. Just because something's always been done doesn't mean that it always has to continue to be done.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm looking at one of the points on, I think this was the thing we can go sign, and it says, government should not prefer one religion over another, or religion over non-religion. My question regards preferring religion over non-religion or vice versa. I would say that one of the more common arguments I see among Christians trying to support various positions is that we're being unfairly targeted in a public setting. For example, it's always been a pretty big issue, creationism or teaching evolution in school, or I guess even in this state extensively, teaching about sexuality, things like that. What would your response be to a Christian who says, well, it's not fair if views the opposite of mine are the only ones that can be talked about? Does that make sense?
I think so. The question is really broad, and so it's hard to answer because I think context matters. So when we're talking about our church, our faith community, the government should have almost no role in what is said and what is taught there, right? But as we move further and further away from a communal body of worship, then the balances change, and at some point, the government is going to have an interest in that, and it's not a clear line for it. It's always at this point, and so yeah, a lot of our religious freedom questions are hard questions, and that's one of the reasons I love my work. Is I get up and every day I have good hard conversations with people, and we don't always agree, but we have good conversations that advance our society and move us forward, and so I'm always hesitant about my religious friends who say that they're not allowed to express their religious view, because often they are, but they don't want the blowback. So they want to be able to say what they want to say and then have no one criticize them back. And that's not a democratic society. Sometimes the blowback definitely goes too far and crosses a line and should not occur in that manner. But the idea that we just get to say whatever we want to say and then never get consequences back from that in our civic society is not a democracy. I don't want to live in a country where the government tells me what a Christian is. Because again, we Baptists have been on the wrong side of that line. Seventh-day Adventists have been on the wrong side of that line. Y'all were some of the leading groups that pushed back against the Sunday closure laws, right? Because you weren't allowed to do any kind of business on Sunday, because the government said Sunday is our day of worship. But y'all had a deep theological conviction that Sunday wasn't the day of worship, that Saturday is the true Sabbath. And you were punished for it because the government said, that's not right. This is what a Christian is. So anytime the government gets to define what a religion is, they get to define who is not in that religion. And that's a dangerous place to be.
Well put. I appreciate your comment on we can say whatever we want, but we can't have no consequences for saying whatever we want. Maybe if I slightly refine the question, where does it go? Where do you draw the line between being non-religious to being anti-religious? I guess that's where a lot of people have concern. And a really specific instance recently was this ruling just recently about prayer on the football field after games. I think it was just in the Supreme Court recently. So I think that was a situation where they were arguing that this ruling was anti-religious, whereas others were saying, no, this is overtly religious if you allow it. Do you have any comment on how we might try to balance that? I know it's a tricky question.
Well, it's okay to be anti-religious in our society. And, as Baptists, we have a deep belief, and I'm pretty sure Seventh-day Adventists do as well, but a deep belief that religion has to be voluntary. That if religion is forced upon you, it is not real religion. So for religion to be vital, it must be voluntary, as one of my predecessors used to say. And so in the case you referenced, BJC had a brief on the side of the school district saying that to allow a coach to lead students in prayer violates the students' religious liberty rights. And our public school students should, their rights should be protected. And so there's a false narrative out there that in court cases it's always the religious claimant versus those who hate religion. And sometimes BJC files a brief on the side of the religious claimant, but sometimes we have filed on the side of the government, saying that what the government is trying to pursue is what builds the pluralistic society that makes it free for all of us. And yeah, so it's hard questions. And there are Christians who protest in ways I don't like. There are agnostics who protest in ways I don't like, and there are rabid atheists who protest in ways that I don't like. But they should be entitled and should be protected in their beliefs, whatever that belief might be.
Thank you.
I would make an observation that religion and government have historically, almost regardless of country, attempted to co-opt each other for their own purposes. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the essence of what we're seeing in the current resurgence of Christian nationalism, where people that are in government are trying to use Christians for their political purposes, and people that are in churches are trying to use government, co-opt government for their purposes. And that's, to me, where we really have to, look carefully at what's going on, who is trying to do what to whom, and, is that fitting either with A, our religion, or B, the Constitution? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that your presentation might be able to benefit more from that, the talking about the attempt to merge influences, whether you're on the government side or the religion side, and how that comes up, for example, in legislation. And that could be, if you think about various types of moral legislation that we have, whether it's a war on drugs or a war on prostitution or a war on whatever, quite often we see that because Christians have been the minority in the past, they have been, the majority, politically, they have been able to basically enforce Christian doctrine with the power of law. And to me, that's a big problem. And of course, a lot of Christians, I'm sure that I'll be criticized for saying that. But, the question that we really should think about is, do we really think it's appropriate for government to be enforcing our Christian beliefs by making them the law of the land? Any comment on that?
No, I mean, that's a great point. And also something that we should think about as a follow-up to that. Often the Christianity that government is trying to enforce is a very narrow slice of Christianity. It's the part of Christianity that supports government, supports power. But if we look at the Bible, if we look at the Gospels, I went to seminary. I love the Bible. I'm an active member of my church. It would be really hard to implement the totality of the Bible into any political system. I mean, think about it. How many times did Jesus tell us to forgive our offender? 77 times. How do we have a criminal justice system based on the idea that we're going to forgive the offender 77 times? It's a great thing to think about and theologically to wrestle with. Practically speaking, that would be really hard to implement, right? There's all kinds of things that don't fit neatly into a government structure or a government system. So often the Christianity that gets talked about is a Christianity that focuses on power and control, which if you're reading the Gospels, that is not what Jesus taught. That is not that's not his life that he lived. That's not his teachings. And so it's really hard to see Christianity in Christian nationalism. They just co-opt our language and our symbols, and so it muddies the waters. If we look back to the Civil Rights Movement, the Ku Klux Klan chose a cross as their symbol of power. There's nothing Christian about what they were doing. Nothing. but they would burn a cross on someone's property to say, I am right and you were wrong. You don't belong here. You're not one of us. And that was our symbol that they used for that purpose, right? And so, we need to be protective of our symbols because people are using our symbols to communicate something very different. And no one outside of Christianity cares about Christian symbols and protecting them. So that's up to us, to stand up for.
Years ago, when I was young and teaching first grade in Richmond, Virginia, in a public school, Christmas came around, and we had Santa Claus. We were allowed to do Santa Claus, but Christmas isn't about Santa Claus. And I had a really hard time understanding why I couldn't explain the other part of Christmas. And then there's Easter. There's Easter bunnies. But Easter is not about Easter bunnies, and I had a really hard time as a Christian understanding why I couldn't explain the other part of it. Mm-hmm. As I've gotten older and married to a lawyer who is very heavily into religious liberty, I do understand, but it's still complex. Mm-hmm. And how do you get a lot of Christians who saw it the way I did to understand you really have to do a very fine line?
Yeah, so, a lot of our public schools set their holiday calendar around the Christian majority's holiday calendar. So that's, the extended break at Christmas and other breaks like that. So there's a lot of debates, a lot of questions. The thing I always go back to is if we look around, driving here, I passed numerous churches. There's a reason y'all have chosen this church to invest your life in. There's a reason y'all chose this church to come to tonight. And so the idea that, just anybody could explain this Christianity, just anybody could do this, defeats the purpose of why we have all these churches. Otherwise, you would just go to the closest one, because they would all be the same. But there's something unique about communities of faith. And then, further along that path, is that Christians that I've heard who have espoused that they wanted to be able to talk more about their Christianity in the public school system, or pray with students, or lead students in religious exercises. They always assume that they're the majority faith. They always assume it's their perspective that's going to be imparted to the kids. Baptists are, I think division is right along the, it's one of the top 5 characteristics of Baptists. We love to have conversation. We love to disagree with one another. We come together over food for fellowship afterwards, but we like the disagreement. I'm the kind of Baptist that ordains women. I'm ordained. I'm very cognizant of those who are investing in kids, because I want my nieces to know that if God calls them to ministry, that they can pursue that. But not every Christian is going to say that, and that's their right. And I will stand up for their theological and their religious beliefs. But that doesn't mean I want them teaching kids. And so in a public school setting, this is the school that everyone goes to. It's all of our taxpayers have a right to be there. And we don't know their religious tradition. We don't know the choices that the parents are making. And so we shouldn't impose our majority belief. One, we may not always be the majority. And so, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, it could be a different religious belief, and you're suddenly on the other side of it. But it's also just not good practice. We should, in public schools, have dialogue about religion. We should learn about the role of religion in history. But we should not use public schools to teach about religious practices or teach about theological meanings, because that's our job as the church. That's our job as people of faith, is to impart those lessons.
I had a question about the abortion thing that got overturned by the Supreme Court. I believe the 6 Catholic justices who managed to vote to overturn abortion. Does that not seem to be maybe a cloaked religious majority view of a religion oppressing a non-religious belief, or overturning something based on their core religious values, even though it may not be cloaked in those words or admitted to on paper in those words.
Yeah, so there's a lot of issues like abortion that people have really strong religious feelings on multiple sides of that issue. It's not religious people are all this and non-religious people are this. And laws are sometimes going to match up with your religious beliefs. That's not a reason that the law is bad. Sometimes the law is not going to match up with your religious belief, and that's not a reason to overturn that law, right? Because law should have secular purposes. Laws are supposed to support the civic society, and so there should be a common basis. There's going to be a lot that comes from that. The decision was grounded in constitutional law, and there are many more cases coming up. We now have religious groups suing, saying that to ban abortion limits their religious freedom because it limits their ability to counsel. And there are religious traditions that do not have an outright objection to all abortions. So it's complicated, the role of faith. As an individual, I know the role of faith in my life and how I approach things. I'm sure that their religious beliefs were part of them and part of that decision. And it's a tough question. It's now been returned to the states, which is what they said they wanted. And so now we all have to have that question and to wrestle with that. But it is a problem if we're going to base laws, if every law has to match up with my religious beliefs, then some of y'all are going to be mad at me and object to it. But one of the old Baptist jokes is, everyone likes a theocracy because they assume that they're theo. But at some point when you're in a theocracy, someone else is theo. And it's their religious beliefs that get the backing of government. It's their religious beliefs that get the power of the state behind it. And then you're left holding a bag that isn't able to protect you.
I want to go back to your discussion on religion and education. So my kids, when they went to elementary school, they went to a private school, and they were taught the tenets of every religion. Mm-hmm. And at Christmas time, it was called, the holidays around the world, I think. And every major religion they learned about. So don't you think it would be valuable for if children learned about all religions, not a single religion, in school? And then there would be more, people understand each other better, there would be less, it's just harder to hate people if you know more about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's yes. Once you meet someone who is different, it's hard to then characterize all those different people as something other or other than. Yes, there's a role for the public schools to talk about the role of religion in our society, but we often, when there are bills introduced to accomplish that purpose, they often cross a line because they want to talk about Christianity, that they want to teach, the meaning of Christian verses, and then everything else is other. Everything else is somehow different from this Christian is standard. This is what we're going to learn, and everything else is different from it, and that is just not a role for our public schools. It is perfectly appropriate for private schools, and that's the role of a private school can teach much more expansively about religion, can teach much more specifically about religion. They can do devotional practices, but that aspect of religion is not what should be taught in our public schools.
I know we're at 8 o'clock. You can go a little longer, I guess, right, Doug? Okay, great. Just a real quick question. What is your take or the take of the organization on mandates and also open borders?
Well, BJC doesn't take positions on big issues. So we take positions on religious freedom as it comes up. I don't know a religious freedom angle for a general open borders question, so I can't answer that one. But as far as mandates, I'm assuming you're talking about the health context and vaccinations and things like that. Public health is a big issue, and mandates have been upheld in the past because we're trying to protect civic society. And so, there's a role for them. Can government go too far? Absolutely. But to say that our elected officials, our public health officials, should have no role in protecting public health, I think negates what we have paid them to do and to advise us on.
My concern, first of all, I completely agree that we shouldn't merge Christianity and the government, okay? My concern is that the feeling has been that all Christian symbols of any cultural background should be expunged. And what this suggests to me is that the secular religion is pushing away the Christian religion. Do you agree?
Do I agree with which part?
I get the feeling that advocates against Christian nationalism would support elimination of any Christian symbol in any public place. I'm uncomfortable with that. It seems to me that a non-religion is a religion, and that's preferring the secularists over Christian religion. Do you agree that any Christian symbol should be excised from the public marketplace?
No, because we as individuals are in the public marketplace, and we as individuals can carry our symbols, and you know, if you know, I often have a cross necklace. I'm not wearing it right now, but this is a vine, and it was given to me as part of my ordination from one of my friends because of the verse that Jesus is the vine and we are the branches. So this is my perpetual reminder of my role in the church. So I should be free to wear this necklace. That's different from the government putting up a cross on City Hall. And I don't want the government to put up a cross on City Hall, because then the government's going to tell me what that cross means. The Supreme Court has upheld our historic monuments. In the cross case, the picture that I showed up there, we had a brief saying that it should be moved off of government property because it sends a message to non-Christians that they are outside of our civic space. And our first point in the Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement was people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to be in the civic square. And so we have a responsibility to all gather and to bring our full self into the civic square. But when the government is picking a side and staking down this Christian symbol is going to represent our town, you're telling everyone in that town who does not follow Christianity and follow probably that specific form of Christianity that they are outsiders and they are not welcome in the civic space. And our civic space should be a place that is neutral, that we are all allowed to gather and express our opinions.
Just as a follow-up, what do you do with all the crosses in Arlington Cemetery?
The crosses in Arlington Cemetery were chosen by those families because they're on the headstones. That is different from the government putting up its own cross, because those were chosen by the families to represent what we as a family want to represent for our service member. There are Stars of David, there are Islamic creches, there's something like 24 different religious symbols that military families can choose for a military tombstone. And that keeps getting expanded because someone looks at the list and says, you know what, none of those match my tradition. Here's the one I want you to create. There's like 7 or 8 different crosses because we all have a different view of the cross, right? And so if it looks just like the plus sign, that carries one theological tradition. If it looks more like a T, that equates more with others. Some put, a second bar, at the bottom, and that carries something else. And so, but those are individual choices being made by individual families. It is not the government saying, this is the cross. This is the only cross that's going to exist because we have declared that this is what this symbol is. And that's what I don't want. I want free expression. I want all of us to bring our symbols. I don't want the government telling me what my religious symbol is.
I think it's dangerous when we get the notion that we have to destroy everything historical that represents a certain belief system. You know that Washington, D.C. was laid out in a certain manner to, I won't say what, but Washington, D.C., the whole town was laid out. All of the buildings in Washington were laid out, to represent certain belief systems. The architecture in Washington is the same way. Our whole society is filled with Christian and Masonic and so forth, and different pagan symbols and so forth. I think when you start removing all these things, it's just going to destroy our culture. I think we need to just accept what has gone before and accept all religions and all belief systems unless they coerce us to believe in a certain manner.
Yeah, that's a good point. But we also need to think about our friends who are from a minority tradition, because the way they look at a government symbol might be a little different. What we see as harmless, they see as egregiously offensive, because it's always reminding them that they are somehow not part of the community and not one of us. But this is why we have dialogue. This is why we have an ability to come together and have discussions, particularly on new buildings and what's going forward and what do we want our city to look like, what do we want our city to reflect. There's a whole industry for church architecture. When we build a church, when we add on to a church, what do we want to communicate through our visuals? And there's now is a profession that didn't exist 50 years ago, that people can focus and specialize in that, because we do communicate so much through buildings, through architecture, through those structures. I totally agree that we need to be able to come together and have conversations. And as I've said a couple of times, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to most religious freedom questions that we have today.
I think the last 2 or 3 comments have kind of demonstrated what is kind of the deep motivation behind what's going on. Christianity has had a privileged position, a dominant position historically, and as demographics are changing, that dominance is being reduced. And I think people, kind of feel threatened when what nobody even thought twice about in the past, because they were so dominant, Christianity was so dominant. But now those things are becoming less commonly held. And I think, many people with a Christian background see their things being taken away, but the reality is, those things belong in a religious setting, not necessarily in a governmental setting. And so I think a lot of what's behind the Christian nationalism is like trying to preserve what is a shrinking privilege and dominance.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And at BJC, and one of the reasons we started the campaign is we see Christian nationalism as a threat to our civil society, to government, but we also see it as a big threat to the church. It's hard to evangelize and to convert people to Christianity if all they know is Christian nationalism. And well, I know what Christianity is, and it's not for me. Well, that's not Christianity at all. It uses my language and my symbols, but they're using them wrong. And so it makes it really hard for us to stand up and be the church when Christian nationalism is what is people's first introduction, and it's constantly there. Tony Campolo is a famous Baptist theologian and pastor, and I think he was the first person to say this statement. Several people have said it since him. But if you can think of separation of church and state like combining manure and ice cream. Doesn't do a whole lot for the manure, but it sure ruins the ice cream. Right? The state is going to take whatever power and authority that it can take. And if the church gives up its prophetic witness to join up with the state, it's the church that loses. The church is always lost when we walk hand in hand with government and refuse to be separate and to be a part and to be willing to be that prophetic voice, to be willing to be the one to stand up and say, king, president, elected official, I think you're wrong, and we need to look out for these who don't have a voice. And that is when, in civil society, that is when the church is at its best, is when we are speaking up to people of power for those who are being overlooked and who are being marginalized.
Well, Jennifer, appreciate it again for you coming and presenting to us. On behalf of our religious committee, Religious Liberty Committee, I want to thank you for your presentation, and also on behalf of the congregation here. And I would also like to thank the Baptist Joint Committee for allowing you to come. I have to also say you've probably made the most robust discussion of any of the presentations we've had so far. This is the most questions by far that we've had. And thank you very much. If you would, we'll bow our heads for prayer and look forward to some of you showing up for our next session next week. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again that we could come together and meet as believers, fellow believers. Also want to thank you that we can have a robust conversation about very important aspects within our community, within our churches, and within our government. I thank you for the insights that Jennifer has provided us with this evening and her perspective. And I want to also thank you for people like herself that work with us on a daily involvement and looking out for interest of both church as well as those that may not be of our same affiliation. We pray that you'll go with us now this evening, watch over us as we return to our homes. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.